So what do I mean by freedom ideologies? Well, freedom is a particular emphasis in Western culture. If we look at other cultures around the world, it's not given nearly as much prominence. And that's reflected in these four dominant ideologies: free market, free internet, free open internet, free speech, and sexual freedom. And we will be coming across the influence of these ways of thinking in ways that we're hardly aware of. They're just part and parcel of our culture. Now, I am not going to be arguing today against freedom. As you'll see, I'm actually a huge fan of it. And certain forms of freedom are indeed absolutely central to human flourishing. But I want to make the argument that the way in which freedom has been narrated in these four ideologies is narrow. It is of a libertarian variety, and this, in short, has supported the freedoms of the more powerful in society and has served profit. It is about freedom from constraints, so that you can do what you want with the resources and power that you've got. And fundamentally, this has been absolutely disastrous for children. I could easily spend a whole day on this topic. I'm going to have to, again, take a spotlight approach, and I'm going to particularly highlight sexual freedom and cyber-libertarianism, free internet. But all of these ideologies do interact, and I'm happy to say more about any of the others. But first of all, some kind of overarching points about it. Libertarianism, what is it? It's very much a distinct political stance and moral psychology. It cannot be reduced to right or left. Indeed, it operates across both and has contributed to, arguably, to blind spots around child abuse on both sides of the political spectrum. So if we look at those four again, free market, free speech, and in particular influence on the right, sexual freedom, and potentially free internet having more influence on the left. And as a result, we've got big blind spots in all parts of politics. Libertarianism's guiding principle is the immediate freedom of individuals, as I just said, in particular from the state and from laws. The concern for this right trumps other rights. So, for example, moral values that are based on care, on connection, on altruism, these tend to be minimised and downplayed. The moral principles that it's generally wrong to harm other people, it's right to protect people from harm, in particular children, and it's right to move towards greater inequality. These are principles that are relatively absent from libertarian philosophy. And maybe this isn't a surprise if we actually look at the psychology of people that hold to a libertarian viewpoint. A large study in America in 2012 compared the psychology of the three main political groups: left, right, liberals, conservatives, and libertarians, and they found that libertarians tended to be more cerebral, less empathic, and less socially connected and interdependent. As they summed up, libertarians have a lower degree of the broad social connections that typify liberals, that's people on the left, as well as lower degree of the tight social connections that tend to typify conservatives. So they are less connected, less interested in relationships than others. And they're not a huge group in society. Quite a small proportion of people would adopt this stance. And yet, it has played an inordinate role in shaping societal approaches to economics, the internet, and sex. Why? Well, as we can already see, it is a stance that legitimises the positions of those with power and wealth. So, arguably, those with power and wealth are drawn to this philosophy and promote it as common sense. It offers very simple visions, and we humans have a proclivity to like simple visions, and these are kind of religious in quality. And I'm not in any way making any negative points here about religion, but rather that these are kind of faith-based positions. There isn't evidence that they are the best way for society to run, but they offer this nice simple vision, and there's an invitation within them to simply surrender to the freedom, freedom of the market, freedom of the internet, freedom of sex, and freedom of speech. These are absolute goods, and all else will be accomplished and, life's fine as long as we just surrender to these freedoms. And it does resonate with this core human desire, which I would argue is actually for autonomy rather than a simplistic freedom, which I know we'll come on to later on. Alongside this, there has been a very successful stigmatising and shaming of those who don't buy in. So, for example, terms like communist used to describe people who aren't neoliberal. Censorship, those that don't agree with the absolute position on free speech. Moral panic, hysterical, prudish. These are all terms in circulation, and often they're not used, but they are avoided. So people are changing what they say and what they do to avoid these labels. So it's delegitimizing people that think differently. There's also the use of discourses of inevitability. So the horse is bolted, and you're never going to be able to stop that happening, so just let it all go, let it all happen, and that's often used around the internet. In parallel with this, we haven't had deeper articulations of freedom and our other core values. These have been missing from society. We haven't had rich philosophy, rich articulations of a different version of freedom, and really that's what I'm arguing for today. Also, like I said, this isn't a position that is clearly right or left, and so it's had an influence across both. So there are a number of issues. Grand abstractions are used to hide the contradictions and unpalatable aspects of this ideology. You'll come across words like open, opportunity, creativity, connection. I would take a look at any of Mark Zuckerberg's speeches. He's a great example of some of this stuff. But we're not drilling down into what these really mean. Do children want to be connected to pedophilic individuals? No. We're not talking about the unpalatable aspects. There isn't a flowchart of the freedoms that are lost downstream when the freedoms of the powerful are left unconstrained. And freedom too is missing. So Isaiah Berlin in 1958 came up with a very influential philosophical paper called Two Concepts of Liberty, which articulated this difference between freedom from and freedom to. Now, I don't want to get lost in semantics, because you could argue that a lot of things, freedom from is also a freedom to in many respects. But it does change the way that we think a little bit. We're not talking about freedom from rules, always, freedom from constraints. We're also talking about, do I have the freedom to do things, to make the most of life's opportunities, to be safe and secure, to live a life without abuse or discrimination, to author a sexuality that is rooted in respect and connection. If I want the freedom to do those things, that's not about being free from rules and social obligations. That's about having protection, and that's about receiving supports in life to be able to do these things. But in libertarianism as well, we find that certain feelings are valorized, such as greed in free market, arousal in sexual freedom, and tolerance. So the right affect of our age, of our culture, is tolerance. We're all taught to be tolerant. Tolerance of people pursuing their freedom in whichever which way they should choose. And feelings that don't fit with that, such as disgust and moral outrage, these are stigmatised, delegitimised, and outlawed. And if anyone's interested in following this in a lot more depth, I'd highly recommend Abigail Gray's 3 papers on this issue. One of them looks at, she's an Australian academic, and she looks at this exhibition by a photographer, Elly Hanson, of naked 13-year-old girls that the Australian Prime Minister was outraged by, and then received a huge backlash from art critics and wider society, which absolutely stigmatised him and others for their outrage, and said that this is just freedom, and there's no problem here. And she then reflects on how she could have a position that saw a paedophilic gaze in those photos, which was effectively not allowed. She was not allowed to think that. we're actually, what happens here is that we start to miss the gaze of the survivor. And also these ideologies, they invite us to split apart different parts of ourselves. So we're encouraged to just follow freedom and not listen to those parts of ourselves that are saying no. We're asked to ignore or minimise core values like love and kindness. Just follow the logic of the market, follow the logic of the internet, follow your arousal. And these other things seem to be forms of repression rather than integral parts of what it means to be human. So I'm now going to just spotlight sexual freedom and look at the influence that this has had on child sexual abuse. Now, of course, again, I'm not arguing against freedom. There should be freedom and positivity around good sexual experiences. And we know there have been a number of great benefits from the sexual revolution, for example, a decrease in homophobia. But in parallel, what we found is that sexual freedom and sex positivity have usually been narrated along libertarian lines. So in sex, freedom should be the focus, and this means following your arousal while apparently ticking a consent box. So I just typed in sex positivity to Google, and the first definition: an attitude towards human sexuality that regards all consensual sexual activities as fundamentally healthy and pleasurable, encouraging sexual pleasure and experimentation. Now, that might sound fine, and at first glance it is, but it is missing. And actually, it is missing a huge amount around sexual ethics. So what this has led to, I will argue, is that sex positive has an actually, in fact, been replaced by the words abuse blind. That so much sex positive narratives are blind to abuse. They are missing. With the focus on freedom, that's foregrounded, and it's replaced a rich sexual ethics which integrate other parts of ourselves. So freedom replaces discussion of equality, honesty, communication, attuning. What I mean by that is attuning to your own emotions, and attuning to the emotions of the other person. Respect and care, and best interests. In sexual experiences, are we thinking about the best interests of ourselves and the other person? Also in sexual experiences, are we drawing on everything about who we are? Our values, all of our emotions, our relatedness, and how we feel not just during that moment, but also beforehand and afterwards. And if we're not thinking about all these things, then we're missing a lot. We're missing power dynamics. We're missing, we're not able to deeply and richly talk about bad sex, unwanted sex, sex that leaves people feeling abused and traumatised, where there are power dynamics. There's sex in an attempt to find self-worth. There's sex that because somebody's dissociated. Interestingly, in studies of women who've been involved in prostitution or sex work, choose your phrase, all of them report dissociating. Societal and social pressure, and sex as self-harm. So there's we need to be talking about these things, and sexual freedom narratives that don't really adequately allow us to do that. So I just want to think about some history around this and some harms that it's wrought. Following from the sexual revolution, pornography bans were abolished in the late 1960s in Denmark and Sweden, and this legalised child sexual abuse material, which used to be called child pornography. So these countries became major producers and exporters of CSAM. I'll just put CSAM. These countries fed flourishing markets in other parts of the world due to lax enforcement of laws. And this is the precursor to the massive crisis in online sexual abuse material that we now have. In the 1980s, there was some positive news. Survivors and their allies and feminists had some success in drawing attention to the scale and harms of sexual abuse. But sadly, their efforts were then drastically undermined by libertarian voices within the intelligentsia, for example, journalists, academics, narrating the problem as one of moral panic and hysteria. And within this narrative, sexual abuse and child sexual abuse images are being exaggerated by hysteria and panic. And notice the, I would argue, misogynistic tones here, that this hysteria and panic are often used to sneer at women in particular. These actually, this moral panic, this is the real threat, not sexual abuse. This moral panic is the real threat. And this threatens our democratic freedom. And this moral panic is responsible for a wide variety of harms. Because they keep on talking about paedophiles, we now see paedophiles everywhere and they don't exist. And also, they've created false memories. Everyone's going on about sexual abuse, so actually now people are thinking that they were sexually abused when they weren't. And these things should be the focus of our attention, not sexual abuse itself. And again, I've got lots of references which I will also provide after the talk. I just don't have time to kind of really show the evidence that this really did happen. I know it can feel quite shocking to those of us that aren't in these circles. Now actually, sadly, the advent of vast amounts of highly viewed and traded child sexual abuse material, alongside a lot of other research, has proven this narrative to be wholly false. However, its existence, successes and harms sadly continue. And it meant that, because this was all going on and it was so successful, that in parallel the internet was getting going, and it meant that we as a society were in a very poor place to deal with the crisis of online sexual abuse that was about to hit us, because people were still trapped in this moral panic narrative and used to thinking about it through that lens. I also want to point to an older history here, that visible within the sexual freedom ideology and its moral panic counterpart is the influence of a strand of Enlightenment thinking that was first promoted by Martin de Sade, who is responsible for the term sadism, in which the libertine is idealised as a countercultural hero, a subject whose courageous commitment to pleasure refuses the sexual misery of an oppressive culture and creates alternative becomings. So in this philosophy, self-mastery, as it's called, is valorized. This is the courage to rise above your inhibitions, the courage to transgress societal boundaries and overcome the petty emotions and rules followed by the lesser mortals. And I use that term deliberately because there is a class dynamic here as well, that this was looking down at the lower people, the tabloid panics around sexual abuse, when we know that really it's all just a moral panic, and actually a tolerance of sexual transgression has become a hegemonic marker of sexual self-empowerment. So as I've noted more generally, we see specifically with sexual freedom that tolerance is the right response, and its opposites, such as judgment, disgust and outrage, are sneered at, shamed and silenced. And certainly as somebody working in this field, I definitely experienced that, I'm sure other people have as well, that if you are drawing attention to some of the stuff under the umbrella of sexual freedom that is fueling abuse, you are having to work hard to avoid these places. And that's telling us something. Why am I having to work hard at positioning myself to not be labelled in this way? Something's happening culturally, and it shows the influence of this ideology. And importantly, not only is tolerance kind of coerced, actually. It's the intolerance of tolerance. We're told that we have to tolerate this stuff. But also transgression is sexualized. It's said to be, it flows from sexual freedom that we tolerate transgression that is sexual. And this sexualization of transgression has arguably driven paedophilic interest and behaviour, as well as related interest in incest, violence and manipulation. And in more general, this general sexual freedom narrative and this confected moral panic narrative have contributed to societal confusion and ambivalence around child sexual abuse. So that, for example, we have a situation in which large-scale child sexual exploitation has not been recognised for decades, instead rendered as a lifestyle choice. This has just been hitting the news yesterday with the report into the Telford CSE scandal. Thousands upon thousands of children are sexually exploited without attention from society. We have to be thinking about what were the cultural forces behind that. How could it be ignored for so long? Because, and I'm not saying that sexual freedom is the only influence, but it's been one of them. That it was too easy to dismiss it as young people exploring their sexuality, because sexual freedom doesn't help us when it comes to power and coercion and control. It's also helped to fuel the corporate sexualisation of children, that's also been enabled by free market ideology. And the online porn industry has been permitted to, on a vast scale, push sexually abusive and heterophilic, by that I mean sexual attraction towards adolescents by adults, and paedophilic material, whilst breaking children into an abuse-produced sexuality. And Naomi Miles is going to be talking more about that in a bit. Furthermore, the abusive heterophilic gaze has become mainstream, so it's normal in our society. It's become very mainstream for adults, for there to be this sexual gaze towards adolescents from adults. So it has fallen to children a lot of the time, being the ones to call it out. This is a petition that was sent to me a couple of weeks ago, set up by school children, asking the government to ban school uniforms in sex shops and pornography. It is disgusting that the sexualisation and investigation of children is apparently condoned by the establishments and companies. This is children who are calling this out. How have we got to this point? Okay, so I now just want to move on to cyber-libertarianism, which, like I said, they all really intersect. And I'll do so briefly. Fundamental features of the internet, when it first got going, disproportionately attracted libertarians to its development and narration. As Mark Zuckerberg said, move fast and break things. If you're not breaking stuff, you're not moving fast enough. Technology is not neutral, but serves as an overwhelming positive force in human culture. We have a moral obligation to increase technology because it increases opportunities. These are libertarian discourses of the internet. Now, whilst we have moved on from this place, and there is now a lot of critical commentary on the digital world and how it's been, how corporations have acted within it and the harms that it's had. Sadly, it got going, it's been going far too long under cyber-libertarianism, and that still has led to contradictions abounding. Many of us implicitly or loosely adhere to a libertarian view of the online, despite not applying its principles elsewhere. So, for example, it's illegal offline to sell porn to those who are under 18, yet it's free and available online, more than freely available, yet children are bombarded with it. It's illegal offline to sell to adults porn that contains adults role-playing to children, that contains real or apparent consent, infliction of pain or lasting physical harm, threats, humiliation, or abuse. Yet copious amounts of this are online, and there are no moves to restrict access. The Online Safety Bill is a fantastic move forward, but it's still, I would argue, hampered by cyber-libertarian motions still holding forth. Naomi here and myself and others are campaigning for this to become illegal offline, but as it stands, the Online Safety Bill is still not there yet. So that, there are also contradictions when you look at how fast technology is evolving to increase corporate freedoms, but not evolving when it comes to increasing child protection and protecting children's autonomy. Governments have been really absolutely slow to regulate tech in a way that wouldn't be countenance for other industries. Outsourcing to corporations decisions that should be made by democratic institutions. This has fueled online child sexual abuse in numerous ways. For example, it has fed into how sex offenders see their lives online. So, for example, one study that was interviewing sex offenders about their kind of psychology found that many of them saw the online space as freer from social constraints that they had to follow in the rest of life. As one offender said, it's a frontier that's just wild and lawless. It's like, being in the Wild West. When you're in that bubble, it's like a very strange virtual world that you're in. And it becomes, you lose track of time, you lose track of place. But most importantly, I think, you lose track of morality. Never a truer word. And at the same time, let's not forget his responsibility. It's this intersection of forces. As I mentioned, there's also been weak and ineffective regulation of child sexual abuse material. The online porn industry has been free to publish and promote abuse and hijack children's sexual development towards its profit. So we've now got a situation where online child sexual abuse is increasing year on year. This is in direct contrast to tech outlets' celebratory headlines saying things like the net is closing in. And again, this just comes from Google searches earlier on this week. No, the net is not closing in, it is wide open. Latest data from the Internet Watch Foundation found that they investigated more reports in 2021 than in the whole first 15 years of their existence. They found that 252,000 were confirmed to contain CSAM, compared to 153,000 in 2020. So look at that massive jump. Some of this is explained by COVID, but either way, we're on a rising trajectory here. Many of these reports included self-generated images, and the fastest growing age group of that in those images is children aged 7 to 10 years old, who are being coerced and groomed and broken in by porn, etc., into making these images that are then circulated by sex offenders online. A recent study by a colleague of mine, Mike Salter, who compared child sexual abuse imagery pre-internet and now, found that contemporary CSAM, on average, victims are younger, abuse is more severe, and adults are more often seen assaulting children rather than images of children alone. There are other, my slides have lots more on than I'm able to go into, but just some other examples there of how it's viewed online child sexual abuse, including online escort agencies trafficking children online for years. This has hopefully now come to an end in America. In Europe, the situation is more unclear. Okay, so then just hopping now onto the third freedom ideology of free speech. This is often wheeled out when corporations and those in power, when their freedoms are being put under threat. So, for example, this quote from UNESCO's report into the chilling of the speech of female journalists. While making fledgling attempts to improve their products to enable easier reporting and filtering of abuse, fledgling attempts, engaging in regular public relations exercises designed to promote their commitment to safe platforms, our research indicates that social media movements have so far failed to respond so effectively to the crisis. Central to this failure is an attempt to use free speech as a shield against accountability. As Richard Wilson at Stop Funding Hate says, this is a misleading self-serving narrative around free speech that has become deeply ingrained in public discourse. This dominant narrative envelops a lot of stuff which isn't speech. I don't see how people are free speech. It protects the speech of the loudest and most powerful voices, and in so doing curtails those of others. I think of a metaphor here. Lots of little birds are tweeting birdsong, and whenever they start tweeting, a big crow comes along and starts squawking. Those birds stop tweeting. If everybody's voice is just equally loud, then those are the naturally privileges, those are the most powerful and bullying. And it downplays other rights. Why is the right to free speech absolute in a way that other rights are not? The right to live free from abuse, the right to be treated with respect. And you'll see this at work in a lot of tech lobbying against regulation. So it's been used to argue against age-verification of pornography. It's been used to protect online hate and paedophilic activity on Twitter, which I've explored with Mike Salter in the paper there. A chief exec of Twitter described it as the free speech wing of the free speech party. And then lastly, fourth fourth ideology, free market capitalism and liberalism. Again, we can spend a whole day on this. And it is one that really intersects with the other talks today, including those I've got this morning. This is the ideology that argues that a market with little regulation should be the dominant organising factor in society. It favours deregulation, so few rules and corporations, things being done privately versus done by the state, low tax and a small state. This is, again, a seductive religious idea that favours some people's freedom above other rights, values and interests. People are assumed to be driven by money and greed versus other things like compassion and altruism. Profit and growth are the absolute goals versus well-being, safety and security. Research by people like Thomas Piketty and many others demonstrates how these policies have increased inequality and poverty, which, as we've learned this morning, cannot be separated from thinking about abuse and neglect. Children do not neatly fit into neoliberalism's model of what it is to be a human, so they become landscapes in which to carve markets. So, as we've seen, poverty and inequality, increasing use and neglect. Industries that at times exploit the distress of those in poverty exacerbate this problem. For example, how sometimes alcohol and gambling industries have behaved. Again, that could be a whole other spotlight of our day we don't have time to explore. Insecurities are evoked in children, this carving of new markets, in order to get them to consume, but in doing so, that creates vulnerability for them to be abused. So, for example, if a child has been groomed into being insecure about their appearance or told that actually what matters about them is their sex appeal, then they become more vulnerable to the overtures of those looking to exploit them. Sexual interest in children is evoked and profited from, as they will talk about, and as we'll hear more about later on today, applying a market model to children's social care has resulted in vast profiteering, i.e. less money being spent on children's best interests. Because, surprise, surprise, people motivated primarily by money are not those best suited to look after children. Now, I don't want us to all be doom and gloom. There is progress in debate. These ideologies are not without criticism and pushback. The online safety bill, as I've mentioned, is a really fantastic move forward. However, there is debate that is still being had about this. And really, the main thing that I want to assert in this talk is that we should grow in our confidence in naming this problem, in naming these ideologies, and championing our own values instead of vagaries and assumptions being allowed to hold sway. Too often, as somebody put it, free speech is deployed as a hand grenade into debate around internet regulation. Let's confidently challenge these words, free speech, online freedom, sexual freedom. Let's actually ask whose freedom. And let's talk about other values, such as fairness, justice, love, equality. Why are these not absolutes? Why do they have to come second to freedom? And lastly, let's reclaim freedom. Let's not leave it to the libertarians. The idea of freedom resonates powerfully with us all. I would argue because it's a proxy for a more fundamental human good, which is our need for autonomy. Again, I could spend a whole lot of time on this. This, at its heart, is the feeling and reality of driving oneself and one's life. A deep agency to act in one's interests. A rich body of philosophy finds that it is very relational. It's not individualistic. If we really get down to our core, we endorse and value the connections we have with others and how we are influenced by them. And it is central to our flourishing, to being human and to having meaning. Again, this is not just me saying this, there's so much evidence showing that it's one of our core human needs. And we enjoy fuller autonomy when we have those freedoms to, rather than freedoms from. So when we are valued and respected by others and ourselves, when we are supported in developing core skills such as self-awareness, critical reflection, imagination, when we have a range of opportunities through which to pursue our life goals, to grow, to achieve well-being, and when we are free from coercion, manipulation, authoritarianism and discrimination, these are four huge threats to our autonomy. So let's confidently talk about this kind of freedom, this rich freedom, which at their heart are true freedoms that complement versus disrespect those of others. For example, when it comes to the internet, we can talk about young people being free to enjoy the online, draw from it in their development, free from abuse, harassment, prejudice and exploitation. Having the right to author a sexuality that is authentic and rooted in respect, intimacy